Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Kat and I make videos about books, writing and other random stuff living rent-free in my neurodivergent brain. Today I'm filming from a secret location. I wanted to try something new and a bit different. If you've watched my channel for a while, maybe you can guess where this is, but the light is rapidly declining, so I hope I can get this filmed before it's too dark. So let's dive into my September and August wrap up. So in August, I had a very ambitious TBR of 16 books, of which I read 11, which for me is a lot, so I'm very pleased with that. The first book that I read in August is A Time to Dance by Padma Venkatraman. This is the story of Veda, who is a dancer of Bharatanatyam, which is a classical style of dance from India. She is very talented, she's winning prizes, and she wants to make this her career. But at the beginning of the book, she is unfortunately in an accident, which results in her losing part of her leg. And so she needs to relearn everything. Basically, she needs to learn to adapt to her new prosthetic leg, learn to walk, and then learn to dance again. And the format of this book was quite interesting because it's written in verses, which I was, to be honest, quite worried about. I thought I was not gonna like it, but I think this stylistical choice is due to the topic again of classical Indian dance, and I think this is to mimic kind of the format of the sacred and classical text that classical Indian dance is based on. And actually I really enjoyed it, and I was very impressed with how the author was able to pack so much in such few words, because each chapter is very, very short. It's like kind of a poem each time, and again it was very impactful. I really loved the relationship of Veda with her grandmother, with her new dancing teachers, and yeah, I really liked this. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it, and it's definitely a book that I will want to reread at some point in the future. This was a buddy read with my friend Rochelle over at Good Morning Dreamer, so I will link her review of this book as well in the description below. Next, I read Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler, and this was also a buddy read that I did with Chelsea from Libraries and Lattes and with Ellen from the Element Book Club. Again, I will link their review in the description below. So Parable of the Talent is the second book in a duology/trilogy from Octavia E. Butler called Earthsteed, and it comes after Parable of the Sower, which a lot of people have talking about on YouTube. I say duology/trilogy because my understanding is that Octavia E. Butler had planned to write 3 books, but unfortunately she never finished the third one, so we only have 2 installments. I don't know if I can say that I enjoyed this book. I can't really say too much because again, it's the second book in a series. But in the first book, we are following Lauren, who lives in a gated communities in a version of the US where things are deteriorating quite rapidly. There is a lot of violence, a lot of poverty. Water is a very limited resource, as well as gas, for example, so people don't really drive anymore because it's just too expensive and too rare. And there is this drug going around which makes people want to set things on fire, which is very scary. And so we follow her life in that gated community, and then as it's at some point overrun by people from the outside, her journey north as she encounter other people and start kind of getting this found family and preaching this new religion that she is forming in her mind and kind of developing this cult at this point, you could say. I was expecting the first book to be a 5-star read for me because I've read kind of similar-ish dystopian novels in the past that really, really impacted me and that I still think about today. Unfortunately, it wasn't as hard hitting for me, this one. And it's a bit hard, like I have a hard time identifying why exactly. But one thing that was a bit disappointing is that there is this speculative element in the novel that Lauren has hyper-empathy, and so she can feel the pain of other people but also their pleasure. And so when she sees someone being hurt, like she does feel it as if she was hurt as well. And she can even, like when she was younger, she said that she would even bleed just watching someone bleeding. And I think there was so much that could have been done with this, but unfortunately I feel that in the book it's not really exploited that much, and it could have been completely removed from the story, and I don't think we would have lost really anything of value. So I don't really understand why there is this speculative element, because again, I don't think it really added to the story, and it created an expectation that wasn't meant for me. Also, being like a very empathetic person, I was quite curious to see how that would be portrayed and used, and what, like, how she would present it in the book, because often being very sensitive and feeling emotions quite deeply is not always portrayed as something very positive in our society. So again, I was curious to see what she would do with it, and I was a bit disappointed that she didn't really do anything with it, really. So the second book we pick up 5 years later, so 5 years after the events of Parable of the Sower. And I won't say too much again because I don't want to spoil anything. I felt that probably this book was a bit stronger than the first one, but at the same time there were also things that were quite frustrating in terms of understanding some relationships between some crucial characters. Yeah, it's been a while that I read it, so I don't have super articulated thought. I think Ellen did a better job, and Chelsea as well. Yeah, I thought it was an interesting read. It's definitely a difficult read because there's a lot of things happening in there that are quite gruesome. Like, it's not necessarily super graphic, like a lot of the violence happens off the page, but if you are a sensitive soul, it's still quite disturbing and distressing, so probably check out the trigger warnings before you pick it up. Next, I read Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This was for Ellen's book club as well, so I will link her review of this book in the description below. And it is my second Madeline Miller book of the year. I read Circe earlier this year, and it was my top book for the first half of the year that I mentioned in my media freakout book tag. Probably jumbling the words here. But so I quite enjoyed this read. I have to say that after reading Circe, the bar was pretty high, and it's probably why I enjoyed it, but it didn't hit as hard as I would expect. Like, I've heard so many people rave about this book, say that it cried all the tears in their bodies and just like were wrecked by it, and that was not really my case. I kind of saw things coming in a way, and I mean, like, you kind of know that it's not going to be a happy ending, just the fact that it's Achilles' story. If you know anything about Greek mythology, then you would know that it's not a happy ending. But also I felt the writing is very strong. The writing is gorgeous. But again, after reading Circe, it was not as impacting for me as when I read Circe. And obviously it's a bit of an unfair comparison because The Song of Achilles is Madeline Miller's first book, whereas Circe is the second one, so she has more experience, she has more miles under a truck. I don't know if that's a real metaphor, but whatever. So she has practiced her craft more, and you definitely feel it in Circe. I think I also related to Circe more, maybe because she's a woman, and the relationship between the characters in The Song of Achilles is still beautiful. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was interesting to see the perspective from Patroclus about Achilles and how a hero is made and kind of the evolution of Achilles throughout the story. So again, I think it's a very strong and very good read. I think my expectations were just too high based on my experience reading Circe and everything I've heard about this book. So it's not a very fair review because I guess the expectations were impossible to meet, and it was not a fair expectation. So I would definitely recommend this book if you want to read it, but maybe keep your expectations in check. Don't be like me. Next, I read an audiobook, which is Empire of Imagination, and is a biography about Gary Gygax, who is the inventor of Dungeons and Dragons. It was an interesting read. I'm glad that I picked it up. I think I was not all the time super focused, so I didn't retain a lot about it, but I think the main thing that was interesting is just seeing how that kind of small, like how Dungeons and Dragons came to be, like coming from kind of war games, tabletop war games, and kind of evolved from that and bringing things together, and how Gary Gygax apparently didn't like Tolkien, even though it's like probably the strongest link that people make. The influence feels quite obvious. Also seeing kind of the trajectory of Gary Gygax and his company, and how there was like scheming and battles of powers, and how he kind of in the end got evicted from his company. So all of that was very interesting. But again, the problem for me with audiobooks is that I don't retain much about them. So I already have my eyes set on another book about Dungeons and Dragons that I've seen in the science fiction bookshop in Stockholm, which I know that my husband is also interested in. So I might pick that up at some point and dive a little bit deeper into that story and how things came to be, because I just find it fascinating. Next, I read Heartstopper, the volume 2 to 5. I don't have them with me because I got them from the library. And so if you don't know, Heartstopper is a graphic novel series following two teenage boys in high school who fall in love and their relationship. And honestly, I don't have much to say about it. It's just incredibly cute and I love it, and it's like a warm hug. And if you're feeling down, it's something that will be comforting, I think, for a lot of people. The third season of the series is out on Netflix, and yeah, it's just lovely. I'm not sure what more there is to say about it. Then I read two more audiobooks. I read Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner, which is about her relationship with her mother and her grieving process through food after her mother passes away from cancer, I think when she's 56 or like in her 50s. And it's narrated by Michelle Zauner herself, which was really nice. Again, my issue with audiobooks is that I don't retain a lot, and I know I was at Stockholm at the time and there was a lot happening, and so I enjoyed the reading while I was in the experience, but I haven't retained a lot from it, if almost anything, to be honest. So it was a good thing to pass the time, be on the subway and things like that. But it didn't really stay with me, unfortunately. I think in terms of expectations, again, I had heard that this was funny. And so I think it was like the contrast of this very sad and hard topic of losing her mother, combined with the idea of like a light and humorous tone that I was very attracted to. But I didn't really find the book funny. It was good. I think it was well written. It was interesting. It was engaging. But I don't know. For me, it wasn't funny. So maybe I just don't get it. But I didn't have the impression that Michelle Zauner was trying to be funny either. So I'm not sure what to think about that. But yeah, a good read overall. But sadly, I don't remember it much. So that's it. And then I read and Les Steros, which is the 5th book in the Fortuna Sworn series by KJ Sutton. And it was a very long audiobook, which sometimes is good. Like, it's a romantasy, so I like that as an audiobook format. I have to say I was a bit disappointed because it was very long, but it felt like so little happened in that book. So again, I can't really say a lot because it's like the 5th book in a series, so I don't want to spoil things. But yeah, I'm just like, how did she manage to put so little in such a long book? Like, yeah, so that's all I have to say. It was fine to pass the time, but I was kind of disappointed, and I don't like. I think it should be mandatory to provide a summary of previous books in fantasy series, because so much happened in this series. Like, you have all sorts of creatures like vampires, werewolves, fairies, like everything you can think of, like mermaids, I think at some point, like everything. And so it's a lot to remember, and honestly I barely remember anything, which I still managed to get into the story. There's a lot of characters, and some of them I didn't even remember who they were really, but I still could follow the story, and again, not much happened. So yeah, definitely not the best of the series. Even if I can't remember what the previous one were like, I'm sure they were better than this one. So I think there's still one more to go, and yeah, I'll probably pick it up because I want to know how it ends. But yeah, this one was disappointing. And then finally, for the month of August, I read My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante because I've been hearing so many good things about it. It was at the top of the New York Times top 100 books of the century or something. And I read it as an ebook on my phone, which is a new experience for me. It's the first book I've read on my phone, again, while I was traveling and while I was trying really hard not to buy more books. So I was able to get it, I think, through Storytel, which is like an audiobook subscription where you can also find ebooks. And so that's how I got it. And I quite enjoyed it. I think it's really hard to give a review of this book because it's a quadrilogy, I believe, and you have a prologue that's much in the future compared to the meat of this story. And then the book ends kind of in the middle of things, and there's no going back to that prologue. So basically, like, it's an incomplete story, so I can't really give a full, like, I don't give ratings anyway, but like I can't form a proper view because again, it's just part of a story. And I find that a bit frustrating because, like, when you're reading a fantasy series or something, like, yes, there's usually a cliffhanger that will make you want to pick the next book, but at least there is like a coherence to this book, like why it's one book. There is an arc, and that's not really the case, I felt, for this one. Again, it just stops in the middle of things, and I would have appreciated it more, I think, if it could have been a story in itself, like an object in itself, and just not like asked you to jump directly into the next one, if that makes sense. That being said, I thought that it was a very fascinating character study of those two girls in the, 1950s in Italy? I was quite impressed with the writing. It's very plain song, so kind of unadorned writing, and there's very few metaphors. So when there's one, like, it really stands out. And despite that, it's still very poignant and conveys a lot of emotion and a lot of nuances, and kind of this main character analyzing what's going on around her and trying to understand this brilliant friend of hers. So yeah, it was quite interesting. And like, when that's the thing, like when I was reading it, it was really grabbing, but then as soon as I stopped, I could just leave the book there in a way. It's kind of strange. So that's why even if the book ends up in the middle of things, I still feel like I'm not sure if I'm going to pick it up, because when you read it, it's so engaging, you want to keep going, but when you put it down, you can just leave it there, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the best I can describe it. September is going to be faster because I only read 4 books, of which 2 I DNF'd. So let's start with those. The first one is sadly this little Buffy novel that I was so excited to have found in a little library next to me. I was looking for one actually after I saw Steph from the Steph Morgan channel feature one in one of her vlogs, and she found one too, and it feels so nostalgic that I was just like, oh, I really want to pick it up. Anyway, it's just a novelization of the first episode of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer series, which I knew. What I didn't remember though is how badly written it is. It's just horrendous, and the translation is bad, but I think probably the source material was bad as well. So it was just a terrible experience. I hated it, and I would rather just watch the first episode again rather than read this. So I just DNF'd it, and I'm gonna unhaul this. The second DNF is Long Live Evil, and I'm so disappointed about this book. I was so excited about it since I heard Rochelle talk about it as one of her most anticipated release for the rest of the year, and the cover looks gorgeous, the premise sounded amazing. It is basically about Ray, who is a young woman in our world. She is sick, very sadly she's dying from cancer, but then this mysterious character shows up and offers her a deal that she can be transported into her favorite fantasy book series, and if she retrieves a specific object, then she will survive in the real world. So obviously she takes that deal, she is transported into that fantasy world, but to her dismay, she realizes that she's not the heroine of the story, she's actually the villain, and she is condemned to death. So it doesn't look too good for her. I don't even know what to say. It was so disappointing. I felt like the writing wasn't great, to say the least. It read very much like a telenovela, and the character's psychology didn't make any sense. Like, at least Ray's psychology, like, I couldn't get her. She was just like all over the place and launching into those long monologues about like being a villain and like villains should unite, and just like, where is this coming from? It doesn't make much sense. Especially the way it's pitched, because if there is an expectation that she would be the heroine, then how is she jumping on board so easily to be the villain? So that was a bit surprising. Also, this is marketed as adult fantasy. The writing is not adult fantasy at all. It's it reads very young, and it's very overdone with a lot of just like, I don't know, like it's dark and you have a lot of snakes and things like that, and it's just like, okay, we get it, like it's an evil world, but yeah, it's just too much, way over the top. It's blending some kind of cheeky humor, which for me really didn't work. So yeah, I really struggled just reading the first few chapters, and I very, very quickly DNF'd it because it was not for me. And I'm so sad because I got this gorgeous edition, which is signed by the author, but I'm gonna unhaul it as well, because there's no way I'm gonna pick this up again. It was just, I don't want to be mean and say it was very bad, but I will say that it was definitely not for me. Okay, I think I need to turn the light on. Okay. I think it's much better. The next book that I read is Liars by Sarah Manguso, and I don't have a copy with me because I've already unhauled it. I read and finished it while I was in Stockholm at the end of September, and I was staying at a hostel where there is this kind of little library concept, but much bigger. So they have a library in the hotel where you can read a book while you're staying, or you can switch with one of your books. So I left that book there because I didn't want to bring it back with me. I didn't find anything that I liked enough to take with me, so I just left it there. But so basically, Liars is about Jane, who is a writer, and she meets John, who is a filmmaker, photographer, and they fall in love and they marry. And it's kind of the story of their relationship and their marriage, and how this kind of nuclear family life is weighing on Jane and conflicting with her writing career. At least that's how it's kind of portrayed on the back cover from what I remember, but it's also very much the story of an abusive marriage. And yeah, John is, the way he's described in the book, we only get the perspective of Jane. He's just an asshole. He sounds horrible. And I was reading this book and I just couldn't understand how, one, she would marry him, how she would decide to make a child with him, how she would stay with him for so long. So yeah, I still I liked the book enough that I finished it, but I think I was more pushed by curiosity, because spoiler, so if you want to read it and don't want to be spoiled, I will put something on the screen so that you can jump. But basically, because the title is Liars plural, in my head, it's very clear why John is a liar in the book, but because it's plural in the title, I was like, okay, then Jane is a liar too. And so I was expecting something like an unreliable narrator, and I was expecting things to take a turn, or just things to start not completely add up. And so I was looking for that, but it's just, spoiler, she's a liar because she pretends her marriage is going fine, basically, to everyone around her, and it's not. And so I was a bit disappointed by that. I was expecting something a bit more complex or something, I don't know. But so that's kind of that curiosity around the title that kept me pushing with this book. But yeah, I was really drawn by the premise. It's very much literary fiction, and the topic felt very interested to me about kind of the kind of family life and motherhood of a writer, and how that kind of can be conflicting, and how she still fights for her writing and her identity as a writer and all of that. So I was very interested by that. The writing, the way the book is structured is kind of short snippets put together, and then you will have a break. So I guess that's kind of a chapter, and then you move on to the next. But sometimes I was just it didn't really make sense why some things were grouped together and then why you had a break. It could just have been the same small snippets without those breaks all along. Anyway, so we're very much in Jane's head and kind of having those little bits of her life. And in a way, some things were, there were some things that were really good, just how with small anecdotes and small detail, the author was able to show just how awful John was, and kind of show a lot about their family life and kind of the power dynamics between them. At the same time, it kind of lacked a direction for me. It's very much vibes and not so much plot, which for some stories I liked, but this one felt a bit like a weird stream of consciousness, or diary entries, and the style is very dry. So yeah, I didn't really enjoy it that much. I was a bit disappointed, and so again, I unhauled it. And then finally, the last book I read in September is The Center by Ayesha Manazir Siddiqi. And this was another buddy read that I did with Ellen from the Ellen Book Club. Sadly, she didn't enjoy that book very much, but I will still share her review in the description below. So that was a reread for me, and I have very ambivalent feelings about this book. I remember the first time I read it, which I think was almost exactly a year ago. I devoured it. I read it very quickly. I think it's very easy to read. It's like 300, it's like barely 300 pages. It's kind of a big font, like it's not that long. And again, it reads very easily. There is a mystery at the heart of it. And once you discover the mystery, I start when that part, I start to feel very uncomfortable. So maybe a bit of context about the book. In the center, we are following Anisa, who is a Pakistani woman living in the UK. She's lived in the UK for more than half her life. She's close to 40 years old, and she's working as a translator. She does subtitles for Bollywood movies, but she feels like it's not a very worthy pursuit, that it's a bit frivolous and not real translation. And so she has this kind of dream of being a real translator, which for her means being a translator of serious work of literary fiction. And one day she meets a guy, Adam, and she gets together with him. They live together, I think, for a couple of years or something. And then at some point, he's invited to go to Pakistan and meet her parents. And so he freaks out and suddenly starts speaking Urdu, which he's very baffled by it, because even though this guy is a kind of language genius, when she tried to teach him Urdu, he couldn't retain 2 words of it. So when he starts speaking fluently, even better than her, she kind of freaks out and she's very angry. And so he reveals his secret, that he's been going to the center to learn those languages. You pay a hefty sum, stay there for 10 days, and then you go out of it completely fluent in the language. And so obviously Anisa decides to go to the center, and there might be ominous things happening. It's not as idyllic as it might seem on the brochure. So I'm a former translator. I love languages, I love translation, and I studied Hindi, which is different from Urdu, but obviously there is a very strong connection. And so I also studied a little bit of Pakistan history and the story of the partition between India and Pakistan. So all of those things put together in the book, I just this is the book for me. I'm so excited about it. And there's a lot that I love about this book. And still that mystery makes me very uncomfortable. And I understand why Ellen maybe didn't enjoy it as much. Because again, that also creates some ambivalent feelings for me. But I think on the second read, it's quite an interesting book. It was fun to reread it, and again, knowing what happens, because then you pick up on all those little crumbs and signs of what's going on. And even the first time I read it, I kind of guessed what was the big twist. But yeah, it's the character of Anisa is quite fascinating, because she will again, we're very much in her head, and she talks about languages, translations, colonialism, racism, all those topics that are very current. And she says things that I could probably say, and I think a lot of us could say. She's kind of that woke person, and at the same time you kind of realize that what she says is a bit empty. She doesn't really go in depth into those topics. And again, I can't go into much details because I don't want to spoil the book, but I think it's quite an interesting book, because you can either read it as just a fun, light kind of mystery, a bit gothic horror book in a way, kind of light on the horror, but yeah, you can read it as that, as just pure entertainment, or you can try to peel the layers and try to dive into it and then play with it. So I think it's a very playful book if you want to again join the game and let the author do her thing, and just yeah, I don't know how to describe it, but yeah, I find it's just an intriguing book, and I was very pleased to reread it, and I was glad to read it with Helen as well. I'm sorry I'm sorry, Helen, that you didn't like it that much, but it was fun. It was fun to read it with you, and I hope the next one will be a better one for you. So yeah, I've been talking for forever and I wanted this video to be short, which it surely won't be. So I'm gonna stop here. I hope you had a very good reading month lately, and so far in October. Again, I'm very late posting this. And yeah, as always, thank you so much for watching me rambling about the books that I read. And hopefully I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.